She had given up on everything, the ranch, the future, even the sunrise that crept through her cracked windows each morning. Mary Bellwether sat on her porch, staring at the sun-baked plains that once fed half the territory. But when that small figure appeared at her gate, clutching nothing but a worn satchel and a hope she'd forgotten existed, everything was about to change. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, his clothes hanging loose on his thin frame like hand-me-downs from a much larger child. His hair was the color of wheat before harvest, matted and unwashed, but his eyes held something Mary hadn't seen in years, determination mixed with desperation. He stood at her gate, not daring to step onto her property, just waiting. Mary watched him from her chair, the same chair where she'd spent the last 3 years watching the world decay around her. The fence posts leaned at dangerous angles, the stable door hung from a single hinge, and weeds had claimed what used to be her kitchen garden. She'd let it all rot, just like she'd let herself rot after losing everything that mattered. The boy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly hungry and exhausted. His satchel looked like it might contain everything he owned, which probably wasn't much. Mary had seen his type before, orphans from the failed settlements, children left behind when families moved on to better prospects or died trying to make them. She should have ignored him, should have gone inside and closed the door, like she did with everyone else who came looking for work, charity, or just human kindness. But something about the way he stood there, not begging, not demanding, just hoping, made her feet move before her mind could stop them. Mary walked to the gate, her boots crunching on the dry grass. Up close, she could see the boy's face was streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but he met her eyes without flinching. Most people couldn't look at her anymore, the bitter widow who'd turned her back on the world. The boy spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper but steady as stone. He said he'd walked for 2 days, that someone in the settlement told him she might need help with the ranch. He didn't mention food or shelter, didn't ask for pity. He offered to work. Mary felt something twist in her chest, something she'd thought was dead and buried with her family. The boy was offering to save her ranch when she'd already decided it wasn't worth saving. He was offering hope when she'd made peace with despair. But Mary Bellwether had learned that hope was dangerous. Hope was what killed her husband when he ventured into that storm to save their livestock. Hope was what killed her children when the fever swept through the valley. She was about to turn away to go back to her chair and let the boy find his hope somewhere else, but then she saw something that stopped her cold. The boy's hands were shaking, and not from the morning chill. Mary opened the gate. She told herself it was just for 1 meal, just long enough to send him on his way with some bread and water. But as the boy stepped onto her property, she noticed his left leg dragged slightly behind the right. He was injured or maybe born that way, yet he'd walked 2 days to get here. The boy introduced himself as Josiah, though he didn't offer a last name. Mary didn't ask for one. In her experience, people who ended up at her gate usually had reasons for keeping their past to themselves. She led him toward the house, watching how he took in every detail of the place, the broken fence, the collapsed chicken coop, the fields that hadn't seen a plow in years. Most people looked at her ranch with pity or judgment. Josiah looked at it like he was seeing possibilities. Mary pushed open the front door, and the hinges screamed in protest. The inside of the house was as neglected as the outside. Dust covered everything, and the fireplace hadn't seen a flame in months. She'd been living off cold beans and stale bread, eating just enough to keep herself alive for no particular reason. But something about having another person in her space made her see it through different eyes. The boy was probably looking at her life and wondering how someone could let everything fall apart so completely. Mary felt a flush of shame she hadn't experienced in years. She moved to the kitchen and began pulling together what passed for a meal, some bread that was only slightly stale, a jar of preserves from better times, and water from the well that thankfully still ran clean. As she worked, she could feel Josiah watching her, not with judgment, but with something that looked almost like gratitude. The boy ate slowly, savoring each bite like it might be his last. Mary found herself eating too, the first real meal she'd shared with another person since her neighbor stopped checking on her last winter. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when 2 people understand something about being alone. When they finished, Josiah cleared his throat. He asked if he could look at the stable, said he'd worked with livestock before, and maybe could tell her what needed fixing. Mary almost laughed. Everything needed fixing. But she nodded and followed him outside. The stable was worse than the house. The roof had partially collapsed, and weeds grew through gaps in the floorboards. But Josiah walked through it like he was surveying a construction project, pointing out which beams were still solid, which walls could be repaired, where new support posts might go. Mary watched him and felt something dangerous stirring in her chest again. The boy was talking about her ranch, like it had a future, like she had a future. But then Josiah said something that changed everything. He mentioned that he'd heard about her in the settlement, about what happened to her family. He said he was sorry for her loss, but then he added something no one had ever said to her before. He said he understood about losing people because he'd lost people too. The way he said it made Mary realize this wasn't just any orphan looking for work. This was a boy who'd seen the same kind of darkness she'd been living in. Mary stared at the boy for a long moment, seeing something in his eyes she recognized all too well, the weight of grief that never really goes away, just learns to hide better. She asked him who he'd lost, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Josiah's voice got quieter when he talked about his family. His parents had died in a stagecoach accident 2 years ago, and he'd been living with his uncle since then. But his uncle had recently remarried, and his new wife made it clear there wasn't room for another mouth to feed, especially one that couldn't work as hard as the other children because of his leg. The boy said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but Mary felt anger rise in her throat. She knew what it was like to be abandoned by people who were supposed to care. After her family died, the neighbors had brought food and kind words for a few weeks, then gradually stopped coming when she made it clear she didn't want their comfort. But this was different. This was a child being thrown away because he wasn't convenient anymore. Mary surprised herself by asking Josiah if he had anywhere else to go. He shook his head, then quickly added that he didn't expect charity. He could work for his keep. He said he was stronger than he looked, and his leg didn't slow him down as much as people thought. As if to prove his point, Josiah moved to a fallen beam in the stable and began trying to lift it. The thing was easily twice his weight, but he struggled with it anyway, his face red with effort. Mary watched him strain against the impossible task and felt something break open inside her chest. She told him to stop, not because she thought he couldn't do it, but because watching him try so hard to prove his worth reminded her too much of herself in the months after the funeral, always trying to prove she could handle the ranch alone, always. Failing, always pushing everyone away when they offered help. Josiah let go of the beam and looked at her with those two old eyes. He asked if that meant she didn't want him to stay. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Mary had spent 3 years convincing herself she was better off alone, that caring about people only led to losing them, that hope was just another word for the pain that comes before everything falls apart. But standing in her broken-down stable with this broken-down boy, she realized something that terrified her. She was tired of being alone, and maybe, just maybe, he was too. But before she could answer his question, they heard the sound of horses approaching fast. Multiple riders coming hard toward the ranch. Josiah's face went white, and he grabbed Mary's arm with surprising strength. He whispered that they needed to hide because the people coming weren't here to help. Mary pulled Josiah behind a stack of old hay bales just as 3 riders thundered into her yard. Through gaps in the stable wall, she could see them clearly. Hard men with harder eyes, the kind who made their living taking things that didn't belong to them. The leader was a tall man with a scar running from his ear to his jaw, and he was looking around her property like he was measuring it for something. Josiah was trembling beside her, and Mary realized these weren't random drifters. They were looking for him specifically, she whispered, asking what he'd done, but Josiah shook his head frantically. He said he hadn't done anything, but his uncle owed these men money, a lot of money, and when his uncle couldn't pay, they decided to take it out on the boy instead. The scarred man dismounted and called out to the house, saying he knew someone was here because the gate was open and there were fresh footprints in the yard. His voice carried the kind of casual menace that came from years of getting what he wanted through fear. He said they were looking for a boy, and they weren't leaving without him. Mary felt rage building in her chest, the first real emotion she'd felt in years that wasn't grief or despair. These men wanted to hurt a child, to settle a debt that wasn't even his. They wanted to destroy what little hope had found its way back into her life. She told Josiah to stay hidden and started to stand, but the boy grabbed her arm again. He begged her not to get involved, said these men were dangerous, and she didn't understand what they were capable of. He'd rather go with them than see her get hurt because of him. But Mary was already moving. She'd lost everything once because she was too weak to fight for it. She wouldn't lose something again because she was too scared to try. She walked out of the stable and faced the 3 men in her yard. The leader smiled when he saw her, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He said they were looking for a boy about 12 years old, probably injured, definitely running from responsibility. He said if she was hiding the boy, things would go easier if she just handed him over. Mary looked at the man and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years, protective fury. She told him there was no boy here, just a broken-down widow trying to mind her own business. The man's smile widened, and he said he could smell lies as well as he could smell fear. One of the other riders started toward the stable, but Mary stepped into his path. She said this was her property and he had no right to search it without cause. The man laughed and pushed past her, but Mary grabbed his arm and held on. The scarred leader's expression changed, and Mary saw the violence in his eyes before he spoke. He said she was making a mistake, that harboring a runaway boy was going to cost her more than she could afford to pay. He looked around at her failing ranch and said it looked like she didn't have much left to lose anyway. But that's when Josiah stepped out of the stable with his hands raised. He said he'd come peacefully if they left Mary alone. The boy was trying to save her, just like she'd been trying to save him. Mary realized they were both about to make the same mistake, sacrificing themselves for someone else's safety. But she also realized something that made her heart race with possibility and terror. Mary stepped between Josiah and the scarred man, her heart pounding with a mix of terror and determination she hadn't felt since her family was alive. She looked at the boy who'd walked 2 days to offer her hope, then at the men who wanted to destroy it, and made a choice that surprised even herself. She told the men that Josiah worked for her now, that he was under her protection, and they could settle any debt with his uncle directly. The scarred leader, Silas Vance, laughed, a sound like gravel scraping against metal. He said a broke widow wasn't in any position to protect anyone, especially not from the kind of men who collected debts with interest. But Mary reached into the house and emerged with something that made all 3 men take notice, her late husband's rifle. She'd forgotten she even owned it until this moment, but her hands remembered how to hold it steady. She said the boy stayed with her, and that was the end of the discussion. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Mary could see Josiah's face pale with fear, but also something else, gratitude mixed with disbelief that someone would fight for him. Silas Vance studied Mary's face, looking for weakness or hesitation, but apparently found neither. She cocked the rifle. The sound echoed across her yard like a thunderclap, and for a moment everything was perfectly still. Silas Vance's hand moved toward his gun but stopped when he saw something in Mary's eyes that told him she wasn't bluffing. She'd already lost everything worth losing. She had nothing left to fear. The standoff lasted an eternity that was probably only seconds. Finally, Silas Vance remounted his horse. He said this wasn't over, that the boy's uncle's debt was now her debt, and debts always got collected one way or another. He said they'd be back when she was alone, when she didn't have that rifle handy. But Mary surprised him again. She said she knew every rancher within a day's ride, and if anything happened to her or the boy, they'd know exactly who to blame. It was a bluff. Most of her neighbors had written her off years ago, but her voice carried enough conviction to make the men think twice. The riders left, but their parting words carried a promise of violence that hung in the air like smoke. Mary lowered the rifle, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. Josiah stared at her like she'd just performed a miracle. He asked why she'd risked her life for someone she barely knew. Mary looked at him and realized she didn't have a good answer, except that for the first time in 3 years, someone had needed her. But as the dust settled from the riders' departure, Mary saw something that made her blood run cold. One of the riders had circled back and was watching them from the ridge above her property. He was too far away to be an immediate threat, but close enough to keep track of their every move. Mary realized these men weren't just collectors, they were hunters, and they'd marked their prey. Josiah saw him too, and sank down onto the porch steps like all the fight had gone out of him. He said he should never have come here, that he'd brought nothing but trouble to someone who'd already suffered enough. He started to gather his things, saying he'd leave before dark and draw the men away from her. But Mary surprised herself again. She sat down beside him and said he wasn't going anywhere, not because she was being charitable, but because she was being selfish. For 3 years, she'd been waiting to die, going through the motions of living without any real purpose. Now she had something to fight for again, and she wasn't ready to give that up. Josiah looked at her like she'd lost her mind. He said those men wouldn't just disappear, that they'd keep coming until they got what they wanted, and what they wanted was him, dead or alive, to send a message to anyone else who thought they could run from their family's debts. Mary stood up and looked toward the ridge where the watcher sat, silhouetted against the sky. She said, maybe it was time to stop running and start fighting back. But first they needed to understand exactly what they were up against. She asked Josiah to tell her everything about his uncle's debt, how much money, what kind of business, why these particular men were involved. The boy's story came out in pieces like pulling splinters from a wound. His uncle, Jasper Flint, had borrowed money to buy cattle that died in a hard winter. When he couldn't pay, he'd borrowed more money to buy seed that failed in a drought. Each loan had bigger interest, meaner lenders. The scarred man, Silas Vance, worked for someone who owned half the territory through debts just like this one. People who couldn't pay lost their land, their livestock, sometimes their lives. Jasper Flint had signed papers putting up everything he owned as collateral, including guardianship of the boy. Mary felt sick. These men didn't just want money, they wanted to own Josiah completely, use him as labor, sell him to someone else, or simply kill him as an example. The debt was just an excuse to claim property they thought no one would fight for. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed a broken-down widow would be too scared or too broken to stand in their way. As the sun started to set, Mary made Josiah help her drag furniture in front of the windows and check that all the doors were locked tight. She cleaned her husband's rifle and counted ammunition, 12 shots. Enough for trouble, but not enough for a war. Josiah asked what they were going to do when the men came back. Mary looked at him and realized she didn't have a plan beyond refusing to surrender, but sometimes refusing to surrender was plan enough. That night they took turns keeping watch. Mary sat by the window with the rifle across her knees, listening to every sound in the darkness. Josiah slept in fits and starts, jerking awake at every creak of the house. Settling around midnight, Mary saw lights moving in the distance, multiple torches heading toward her ranch in a slow, deliberate line. The men were coming back, and this time they'd brought friends. Mary woke Josiah and positioned him by the back window while she kept watch at the front. The torches were moving closer, and she could count at least 6 of them now. Silas Vance had brought reinforcements, probably figuring a show of force would be enough to break her resolve. But as the lights approached, something unexpected happened. The torches split into 2 groups, with some heading toward her neighbor's property to the east. Mary's heart sank as she realized what was happening. Silas Vance wasn't just coming for Josiah, he was spreading his men out to make sure no one could come to her aid. Josiah whispered from his position that he could see riders surrounding the back of the property too. They were trapped, outnumbered, and completely cut off from help. The boy's voice cracked when he said he was sorry for bringing this down on her. Mary told him to be quiet and keep watching. Her mind was racing, trying to think of something, anything, that could turn the odds in their favor. Then she remembered something her husband used to say about cornered animals being the most dangerous because they had nothing left to lose. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and soon she could see the riders clearly in the moonlight. Silas Vance was in the lead, and Mary counted 7 men total, more than she'd hoped for, but fewer than she'd feared. They stopped just outside her gate, and Silas Vance called out to the house. He said he'd brought friends to help settle their business peacefully. All she had to do was send the boy out, and they'd leave her property untouched. He said fighting would only make things worse for everyone involved, especially for Josiah. Mary's response was to raise the rifle and put a shot into the ground near Silas Vance's horse. The animal reared and several of the other riders drew their weapons, but Silas Vance held up a hand, calling for calm. He said shooting at them was a declaration of war, and wars had casualties. That's when Mary played her last card. She called out that she'd sent word to the federal marshal about armed men threatening property owners over fraudulent debts. It was another bluff. but her voice carried enough authority to make some of the riders exchange uncertain glances. Silas Vance wasn't buying it. He said the nearest marshal was 3 days away, and they'd be long gone by then. He dismounted and started walking toward the house, his men following his lead. The time for talking was over. Mary took careful aim and put her second shot into the gatepost, inches from Silas Vance's head. This time he didn't stop walking. He said she only had so many bullets and he had all night. But then something happened that changed everything. A new voice called out from the darkness beyond the riders, telling them to stop where they were. Mary's heart leaped with desperate hope, but when she saw who emerged from the shadows, her blood turned to ice. It wasn't the cavalry coming to save them, it was Josiah's uncle, Jasper Flint, and he wasn't alone. Jasper Flint rode into the torchlight with 2 other men, and Mary could see the family resemblance immediately. He had the same wheat-colored hair as the boy, but his face was weathered and weak in a way that spoke of too many compromises and not enough backbone. This was a man who'd sold his nephew to cover his own debts. But what made Mary's situation truly desperate was seeing who rode beside him, Judge Sterling Beaumont, the territorial judge who handled debt collections and property seizures. The man who could make everything Silas Vance was doing completely legal with a stroke of his pen. Silas Vance smiled when he saw the newcomers, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. He said Jasper Flint had come to reclaim his property and settle his obligations properly. The judge nodded gravely and announced that he was here to oversee the legal transfer of guardianship and ensure all debts were satisfied according to territorial law. Josiah's face appeared in the window beside Mary, and she could see the betrayal written across his features. His uncle had not only abandoned him, he'd sold him outright to clear his own slate. The boy's last hope of family had just evaporated in front of his eyes. Jasper Flint called out to the house, saying Josiah needed to come out and face his responsibilities. He said the boy belonged to him legally, and Mary had no right to interfere with family business. His voice carried shame, but not enough to stop him from going through with it. Mary felt rage building in her chest, the kind of anger that burns clean and hot. She'd seen men like this before, cowards who destroyed others to save themselves. She told him that any man who would trade a child to cover his debts wasn't fit to call himself family. The judge cleared his throat and announced that, sentiment aside, the law was clear. The boy was legally bound to his guardian's debts, and interference with debt collection was a territorial offense. He said Mary had 1 minute to release the child or face charges herself, but Mary had made her choice. She told them they could all go to hell. Jasper Flint looked genuinely surprised, like he'd expected her to see reason once official authority arrived. He said she was making things harder for everyone, especially for Josiah. If she really cared about the boy, she'd let him do what needed to be done. That's when Josiah spoke up from inside the house, his young voice carrying clearly in the night air. He said his uncle was a coward and a liar, and he'd rather die than go with him. He said Mary was the only family he had now. The words hit Mary like a physical blow. This broken boy with nowhere else to go was choosing her over his own blood. He was willing to fight and die beside her rather than surrender to the people who should have protected him. Mary made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her 3 days ago. She stepped out onto the porch with her rifle raised and told them all to get off her property. She said Josiah wasn't going anywhere, and anyone who wanted to take him would have to go through her first. Silas Vance's patience finally snapped. He drew his gun and said he was done playing games with a crazy widow. But before he could fire, Mary's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. The other men scattered, drawing weapons and taking cover. The judge's horse bolted, carrying him away from the gunfight he'd helped create. Jasper Flint crouched behind Silas Vance's fallen horse, calling for everyone to stop shooting, but the damage was done. Silas Vance was screaming orders from the ground, and his men were closing in on the house from all sides. Mary had maybe 10 shots left and at least 6 men still standing. Then Josiah appeared beside her with her husband's old pistol, limping but determined. He said if they were going to make a stand, they'd make it together. The final battle for both their futures was about to begin. But sometimes fighting for something worth saving was more important than winning. The gunfight lasted 20 minutes and ended when Mary's shots brought down 2 more of Silas Vance's men and wounded a 3rd. The survivors, including Silas Vance himself, retreated into the darkness, carrying their wounded and shouting threats about coming back with more men, but they never did come back. Word spread about the widow who'd faced down armed debt collectors to protect an orphan boy, and territorial authorities started asking uncomfortable questions about Silas Vance's operation. The judge disappeared entirely, probably to avoid explaining his role in the affair. Jasper Flint tried once more to reclaim the boy, this time through legal channels, but Mary had hired a lawyer with money she'd hidden away for years, and the case was thrown out when it came to light that Jasper Flint had sold guardianship to cover gambling debts, which wasn't legal under territorial law. Mary and Josiah rebuilt the ranch together over the following months. The boy's legs slowed him down some, but his determination more than made up for it. They planted new crops, repaired the stable, and slowly brought life back to land that had been left to die. Mary never remarried, and Josiah never left. They became the family neither of them thought they'd have again, the broken widow who'd forgotten how to hope, and the orphan boy who'd reminded her what was worth fighting for.